Welcome to the Network for Responsible Public Policy. I'm Jenny Wilson, a trustee of NFRPP. In keeping with our mission to bring timely, fact-based programs to educate, inform, and foster civic engagement, tonight we'll focus on another subject that touches us all, the environment. The current administration denies climate change and is canceling many of the policies and regulations designed to address its impact on the climate. This makes tonight's discussion particularly well-timed. Our speakers represent a cross-section of successful public and private programs that address the environment with a focus on initiatives that can be scaled from the local level to a broader, more expansive use. NFRPP programs bring credible information to our growing audience. Our speakers come prepared with reliable data, facts, research, analyses, critical thinking, and real lived experiences. You, our audience, represent all sides of the political spectrum, which always results in smart audience questions. So please use the Q&A box to ask your questions. Our speakers will respond to as many as time allows. Please note your questions might not appear on your screen. Don't worry, we can see them. If you value our timely programs and the fact-based presentations we bring throughout the year, please support our work. Visit our website, nfrpp.org, to learn more about our giving campaign. Tonight, we're pleased to introduce our intern, Ramapo College senior, Ashley Clenord. Ashley is an environmental studies major with a double minor in public policy and sustainability. And as part of her work with us this semester, Ashley helped organize tonight's program. So it's appropriate that Ashley introduce our speakers. Ashley, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jenny. Tonight, we have a remarkable panel of experts on the environment who bring perspectives from the public and private sectors. Dale Bryk is Director of State and Regional Policy at the Harvard Environmental and Energy Law Program and a Senior Fellow at the Regional Plan Association. She helped launch the Conveners Network, which supports state efforts to develop climate and clean energy strategies and access and deploy federal resources to advance them. Dan Sosland is president of Acadia Center, a position he has held since co-founding the organization in 1998, one of the first nonprofit organizations created to address climate solutions at the regional level. Acadia Center focuses on climate and clean energy solutions that reduce climate pollution while improving public health and consumer economic and equity benefits. Richard Idlin, moderator, has over 35 years of experience in the intersection of sustainable business, public policy, and advocacy. He helped establish organizations such as the American Sustainable Business Council, the International Council of Local Environmental Initiatives, Business for America, and the United Nations Environmental Finance Initiative. Please visit the NFRPP website to read their extensive biographies. Dale, Dan, and Richard, thank you for joining us tonight. Let's get started.
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you, Jenny, and good evening, everyone. Thanks for being with us. So I want to just lay out a little context of what the conversation with Dale and Dan will involve. And then, as Jenny noted, we're happy to have your questions and use the Q&A button for that purpose. So let's start with an acknowledgement that when President Trump was running for office, he had pledged to minimize the burdensome nature of regulations on states and localities. And he approached this, maybe calling this out as some type of new federalism. And instead, I think what we have seen over the past several months is really an unprecedented involvement on part of the federal government in how states and localities are making choices about environmental policy and energy policy. And you may have been reading all sorts of decision about all sorts of decisions that the administration has made, including doing away with the EPA, much vaunted and very well received Energy Star program, deciding not to invest any money in California's high-speed rail system, arguing with New York State and about congestion pricing in New York City, issuing an executive order which prohibits states from pursuing their own choices on energy policy. And instead, what we are seeing is a full-on support and investment in oil, gas, and other greenhouse gas producing fuels. The Trump administration has made it very clear that they are supporting all of the above, but it does seem quite apparent that wind projects and solar installations are not receiving federal support. One example, for those of you in the New Jersey, New York area, is the Empire Wind Project, which was just put on hold. And that's an offshore project that was going to provide electricity to 500,000 homes in New York State. And there are lots of other examples that we'll talk about, ranging from EPA to the Department of Interior to the Department of Energy to what the Attorney General's office is doing. Just two final notes here before we begin the conversation. Greenhouse gas emissions in the United States over the past decade have actually been on the decline. And that's a good thing because climate change is a significant economic threat to communities throughout the country. And severe weather incidents have become more dramatic and more impactful and more costly. And we see business responding in a very cautious way, whether it's construction or the insurance industry. But we're also noticing that energy consumption has begun to rise in the past year or two, particularly because of large-scale data centers propelling AI. So we have a real challenge ahead of ourselves here in the coming years. And the conversation tonight with Dale and Dan is to identify some possible solutions, what you in your local community or in state can do, how you can maybe engage civically, or maybe you can engage on a policy basis, working with your state legislator, your local legislator, or calling your member of Congress. So with that, Dale and Dan, thanks for joining us. And Dale, let me start with you. We had talked a little bit about the executive order, which was issued on April 8th. It's called Protecting American Energy from State Overreach. And I'll just read the first sentence and ask you to comment on that. My administration is committed to unleashing American energy, especially through the removal of all illegitimate impediments to the identification, development, siting, production, investment in the following domestic energy resources: coal, oil, natural gas, hydropower, geothermal, biofuel, critical minerals, and nuclear energy resources. So, given what you know, Dale, about how states build their own energy policies, and in many cases, Republicans and Democrats agree that a diversified portfolio is smart. What do you make of this executive order?
Yeah. Well, thanks for that whole entire litany, as well as the executive order. It's quite overwhelming, and you're only really scratching the surface. And that executive order is sort of par for the course. I mean, you kind of described it's sort of a mindless assault on anything that sounds clean, even things that have such long-standing bipartisan support, like you mentioned, Energy Star. So I think part of what states are and localities are doing, and what we have to do here, is not chase the chaos of things like that executive order, which I think, the there's a threat there of litigation against state policies, but state policies are always litigated. There's already a longstanding opposition, so I don't think there's a new threat here. It's more, I mean, with that specific executive order, but there are a series of threats, and we can talk through them this evening. But I just put out sort of some initial big picture thoughts to for context of how we can operate here. And I think what we're seeing from states, which is, states have an affirmative agenda for their energy policies, and they have to remain focused on them and not chase the chaos. At the same time, they have to defend themselves against the assaults that they're facing. And we're already seeing a huge amount of litigation. I just read today, 135 wins to date already in this short period of time in the litigation that states and localities and businesses are bringing to defend themselves. And then we often say the arc of history bends towards justice. And I think the arc of history also bends towards clean energy. Like this is a transition that is happening globally, and it's going to happen. So this is, there are a series of things that the federal government is doing that are going to make it more expensive for everybody, all energy more expensive, that are going to make it more time consuming, that are going to hurt people. But it's not going to stop the transition. Right. It's just going to make it more difficult.
Right. I know that you were recently appointed, Dale, to the NYSERDA board, and maybe you could tell people what NYSERDA is and what the role of utilities are. Be they privately owned or publicly held, utilities in energy policy at the state level, and maybe from a regional context also, if you could shed some light on that.
Yeah. So NYSERDA is the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. Many states have an energy office, but not many states have an operation the size and breadth of NYSERDA. So they do all kinds of analysis and planning and design for the energy policy and strategy of New York State. But many states do this in without such a large operation as we have with NYSERDA. So for example, in New York, NYSERDA actually designed and implements the whole strategy for contracting with offshore wind and developing the whole offshore wind industry. And a lot of states in the region stood on the shoulders of that work to help launch that industry in this country. Utilities are also incredibly important, and I think important to this conversation because they're overwhelmingly regulated at the state level. So every state has a utility commission, and that sort of sets the rules for the business of the utility, how the utilities decide how they're going to, in states like in the Northeast, they purchase the electricity from generators and deliver it to us customers. In some states, they're what we call vertically integrated. They own the generation. In that case, the utility commissions are deciding what kinds of facilities they develop and own. So all of that work still happens at the state level. So the decision making around energy policy as it relates to utilities remains very state focused, but it's not entirely state focused. So we have FERC, we have renewable, we have regional transmission organizations, and which I think are they're a very important part of this conversation, because how the states can play in those organizations and the influence that they have to continue to advance their policy objectives and their vision for the energy future in their states really matters.
Right. So what I'm hearing, and Dan, I'd like to get you into this conversation. What I'm hearing is that there's a long history of federal and state collaboration, right, on a variety of programs. And Dan, I know you've done a lot of work on RGGI, and maybe you could describe that in the context of state energy policy that's particularly focused on reducing climate and the importance of those agreements between states, in light of the Trump administration's sort of withdrawal from addressing climate.
Well, thanks, Richard. Yeah, so states have a tremendous amount of jurisdiction over energy issues, but also I think it's really important to point out over many of the sectors of the economy that produce emissions, transportation, land use, zoning, building codes, energy building codes are at the state and local level. Um, and then states do cooperate. And the RGGI program that you're referencing is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. It's been around since I think 2006-ish, something like that. It's 10 states, basically from Maine to Maryland. Virginia was in for a little while. Pennsylvania was supposed to come in, but basically it's 10 states that have cooperated on a program to set an emission cap for power plants, electric generating power plants, greater than 25 megawatts. And that's the bulk of energy, of electricity generation in the region. And the cap is set, and then there's a trading system created, an auction. So if a power plant needs to issue, pollute, um, emit a ton of CO2, they have to buy a credit. And that credit then is auctioned, and the money is collected. So over the period of the RGGI program, about $9 billion has been raised. Now, $9 billion then goes back into energy efficiency programs and state renewable programs and consumer rebates and weatherization programs, um, which have an enormous cost-benefit ratio. Um, so I think the other point that we've alluded to already is states have a lot of control over what their energy mix should be. You said this in your opening remarks. So there are programs like called renewable portfolio standards, and states have had these in place for 25 years, um,
And could you
where
just,
they say
could you just
they
describe what that is, Dan? Thanks.
so a renewable portfolio standard basically is a policy enacted by the state legislature, um, and it says over time we're requiring utilities who purchase power from power plants to purchase X amount from solar or wind or clean energy resources. The definitions of those resources change by state. Some include hydrogen, some don't. It's a mix, but it's clearly within state jurisdiction. Um, so the executive order you are referencing and that Dale's commented on has started to target these state climate laws and state energy laws. And there's a perception that they are only beginning, that they're going to start targeting programs like RGGI and policies like renewable portfolio standards, that there's been no disagreement over 20 years and many decades that those are within state jurisdiction. And those have been adopted by both Democratic legislatures and governors and Republican ones. And RGGI is a program that has been supported by Republican governors, and Democratic governors. And I think another point I'll just leave my comment with here is data matters. You know, the Trump administration might decide they're going to change the landscape, change the laws, change federalism, change 200-year-old policies of adhering to court decisions, but they're not going to change the climate crisis. It exists, and much of the progress around clean energy market transition is happening, as Dale said, and it will happen because the data supports it. It's more cost effective. It's cheaper. Ratepayers will benefit. Economic productivity will grow. All of those things will happen with the clean energy economy. And so it's really, I think it's important to keep that in mind as we face this assault on state policy, state programs, state coordination, and climate science.
Mhm. And Dan, what is your understanding of the legal theory that the administration is pursuing to upend state policy or local policies?
Well, I was trained as a lawyer, and I really believe in the legal profession. And I've read these executive orders, and not as a climate advocate or environmental advocate, as a someone who believes in the law and that the legal profession is a noble profession. These are some of the most poorly written. The governor of Maine characterized some of the letters she's getting from the administration as childish. So I can't help but note that, Richard, as we ask this question, I think their legal theory is that they're trying to use is always national security and threats to national security. So everything is a threat to national security. Climate laws are a threat to national security. Anything that might impede coal or oil or fossil fuel generation and consumption is a threat to national security. I don't think anyone really believes that's a credible theory. the fact of the matter is many states benefit, particularly northeastern states, by wind and by solar and by energy efficiency, where they don't produce their own fossil fuels. They have to send billions of dollars out of their economies to places that they have to purchase it from. So what the national security argument really is, I think, is the opposite, is that if we don't pursue a clean energy economy, we will continue to be dependent on unreliable, volatile international fossil fuel markets from very dependable places like the Middle East. And, yes, it just doesn't make sense. So I think at some point, it's really important to go back to the data and the economics of all this, because the data and the economics support economic productivity increasing with clean energy investments. And all the other aspects of steps states and the country should take to reduce climate pollution. It's just much more cost effective.
I was reading something from Citizens Climate Lobby earlier this week, and they note that in 2024, solar electricity represented 61% of all new electricity generation in our country, with more expected in 2025. So clearly, renewables are creating tremendous economic gain and addressing climate. Dale, let me ask you to sort of build on this point that Dan mentioned about Republican and Democratic-led states have adopted renewable portfolio standards. And the mix of fuels varies from Iowa to Massachusetts. But most states, I think 39, maybe close to 40 states now have some renewable portfolio standard. So in your work in the field, Dale, what have you found sort of is the common motivator in state legislators to create an RPS?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it is what Dan was just saying, that state is a climate martyr, right? Every state is figuring out what is good for my constituents and what is the sort of economic trajectory, because energy is so core to the entire economy, all the sectors, and we should talk about the non-power generation sectors more as well. So, keeping those dollars in your local economy, job creation. I mean, there are a lot of policies in the climate arena, the building.
Dale, I think we lost. Yep. Go ahead.
No.
Say you became unstable there for
my
5
internet
seconds.
is unstable for 5 seconds.
Yes, just repeat that if you would.
Yeah, I'm just saying that the policies have many benefits, and those benefits are drivers. So in lots of states, climate is not the driver, job creation is the driver, or just energy costs, reducing energy costs, keeping energy dollars in the local economy. I mean, and sometimes it's just also the resources that you have in your state. I mean, the states that produce the most wind energy in this country are Texas, Oklahoma, and I think is Iowa the other one? There, and then Kansas is the next after that. I mean, these are all states that maybe don't have ambitious climate policies. Where do we have the most heat pumps? South Carolina. Because they're energy efficient. We're just helping people lower energy bills. It goes to the bipartisan support for Energy Star and energy efficiency, policy started by Ronald Reagan, and the bipartisan support very strong that we've had for renewable policies for many, many years now. So if you go into other sectors, I mean, I was mentioning buildings when I lost internet. You think of every building in your state, and you want to make that building super energy efficient and ultimately electrify heating and cooling in those buildings. How many people, plumbers, electricians, contractors are going into those buildings? All the designers, the manufacturers. That is a huge, huge job creation enterprise, even if you weren't interested in climate for advancing it.
And it's a technological driver also and a source of innovation. And I think one of the critiques that I've read from conservatives about the Trump administration energy policy thus far is that it really is interfering in the market. and it is not allowing market forces, which are pushing renewables into the forefront, to succeed. And in fact, the government is picking winners and losers, which is sort of antithetical to.
Right. Historically, what you think that was a Republican mantra, that you would allow markets to function. And there are market failures. There are reasons to intervene in markets. That's why we have standards of performance and lots of policies. But affirmatively picking winners and affirmatively attacking the technologies that you don't care for. I mean, we just saw a stop work order. You mentioned offshore wind in the Northeast. And there is a limit to what states can do when you have to have federal leases and the federal administration is willing to renege on signed contracts. What can you rely on if you can't rely on the signature of the U.S. government on a signed contract that you have to do business? Who's going to do business here?
Right. Dan, let me ask you, and then Dale, love your perspective too on this idea of transition. And there are lots of ways to think about transitioning from fossil fuels to clean energy. And then a question that we have asks about, what is our time frame here, right? How worried should we be, and by extension, how quickly should we act? And are we really setting ourselves up for failure by reneging on these commitments that the U.S. has made over the past, decade? So, Dan, you want to take a first pass at that, and then Dale?
There's a lot there to talk about. Well, the clean energy transition, I think it's really hopeful to think about it as a technology transition. And I don't mean to sound flip here, but we used to light street lamps with whale blubber, right? And then we replaced that with kerosene or whatever. And then, it's an evolution in technology. And now we're at an evolution where we don't need fossil fuels to provide the energy need that it provided for so many years. Wind, solar, storage, battery storage, energy efficiency, targeted weatherization of buildings, hydropower. They can provide cleaner power, often at lower cost. The market point that you're making, in the New England grid, which is 6 states, about 13 million people, not that long ago, 10, 15 years ago, was 21% coal. It's less than 1% coal now. Now, is that the function of state policy? In part, yes. Is it the function of RGGI? In part, yes. They are sending price signals into the marketplace. It's also a function that coal is not competitive on a price basis. Southern Company, which is down in the southeastern Georgia, and also flipped from coal to natural gas because of the market pressure. So there's a continuum here where if you intrude in those markets, it's an artificial barrier that's being created about the transition. And it's really, the more clean energy we have, the better it is for public health, the better it is for economic productivity in most states, except fossil fuel producing ones. So there's a lot to talk about there. In terms of the time frame, states and international agreements talk about targets in 2025 and 2030, 2050. And really, it's the 2050 target of 80% reductions from a baseline year of 2005 or whatever year it is, and even 100% net zero. So we're on a time frame where a lot of these laws were put into place around the year 2000, 2001, 2003 at the state level. Connecticut and Maine were among the two of the first 3 states to do it, I think California. So are we on track to meet those targets? If we are not on track to meet the 2025, 2030, we won't meet necessarily the 2050, and the more expensive it will be to meet those targets. This isn't ideology, as the Trump executive orders claim, but this is science, this is data. There's complete consensus now that greenhouse gases are warming the planet. That's a production of human activity. The longer we delay in meeting the challenge and the more we put barriers to cost-effective solutions, which are technically and technology the technology is available. It's amazing, really, the change that's happened. I mean, it's a credit to ingenuity that these technologies exist now. The longer we delay that, the more likely we will have more serious climate threats, which are already happening. And, maybe it's worth reminding ourselves of everything that's been going on with storm damage, hurricane intensity in this country alone. And we are facing the crisis right now. It's having a real effect. And the longer we wait, the more expensive and the more damage it will be caused. So this isn't a blip necessarily, that's affordable. I mean, losing 4 more years is really going to be damaging to meeting the 2030, 2035 targets as we head to 2050.
Dale, let me
Yeah.
ask you to take a slightly different take on that question, and please say what you wanted to anyway. But given that you have worked on the idea of equitable transition, and you're welcome to explain that. I'm curious as to how you think about this transition in technology, how the introduction of new technologies has, disproportionate impact in certain communities. Certain people benefit, certain industries benefit from new technologies, and other people in the short term lose out because they may not have the skills to work in that new industry. So how do you think about the transition that we're in towards a more clean energy future?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is good to have sort of a common understanding of equity, because I think there's some sentiment that equity means like someone else is getting something and I'm not getting it, as opposed to, again, data, fact-based, that, we know that there are communities across the country who have historically been both overburdened by pollution from everything that we do and underserved by the clean energy solutions, and that in fact the rising tide, as we have been transitioning to clean energy in lots of areas and sectors, is not actually lifting all boats. And then you have a different set of equity issues that you also raised, which are around the transition. Maybe there are a lot more clean energy jobs than dirty energy jobs, but not in my town. If I live in a rural area and I've been working at a coal plant and there's a lot of jobs in buildings, like that's not here. These are not where all the buildings are. So there is a disconnect. And that's part of the work. Like, I think of it as, what does a just and orderly transition look like for all of the players? I mean, people, us. And then thinking about that sector by sector, what's actually happening, and then, what can we do about it? And I also think about it as with the term externalities, like why do we have policy? Why do we intervene in the market? Why is the market not going to solve all of our problems? Because the market has a lot of failures. And when you think about like a technology transition that leaves somebody behind, that's a failure of the market. When you think of, I turn the light on and some coal plant over there is spewing pollution into the mouth of my neighbor. A diesel truck is driving by and spewing mouth into my kids. What are the asthma rates at your school? Why is this happening? Those are all externalities. Nobody pays for that. We pay for it in our kind of public health bill through our tax dollars and in our own health and our family's health. So policy is in part designed to address those externalities and figure out, why is the market failing and how can we intervene? And Reggie is a wonderful example of that. But it would be good to, one little point I wanted to make about the Reggie lessons learned, which are many, and I highly recommend all the reports that come from Acadia, Dan's shop, about how Reggie has functioned over the years. Because you ask any person in the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic states, what do they think about Reggie? They'll have no idea what you're talking about. Why? Because the impact to people on their energy bill is de minimis. It's the charges that he was talking about are so tiny. But if you ask them about things like energy efficiency programs or renewable portfolio standards, or things that actually affect their lives, you could reduce your energy bill by 30% by participating in these programs that are funded by Reggie, funded by utility programs, and policy that's designed to intervene and help make something happen that's not happening, but that makes economic sense in the big picture, and that's going to improve quality of life for people. So I think that's part of what we have to be thinking about when we're thinking about just and equitable transition, are all those opportunities to intervene and help it work better and, sort of prevent the bad things from happening that can happen in a transition, whether or not it's being driven by public policy.
Okay, thank you. That was really helpful. Dan, when you think about externalities in the work you've been doing, what are some stories that you think are important for us to consider as decisions are made to site a facility, a power plant, and who ends up paying for those costs? Any insights on that?
Well, yeah, I'll offer a few thoughts. Thank you. I think we do pay for the cost. Pollution affects people's health. Same sources of pollution that affect the climate are producing ambient criteria pollutants, can get into your lungs and, cause human health problems, breathing problems. Once we had a program that was addressing diesel emissions, and we were able to get these monitors and stand near a off-ramp on the interstate near an apartment building, and as the trucks went by, the monitor went off, and there happened to be a visual over there to New Haven, Connecticut, and there was a girl looking out of her window from the apartment building. The window's covered in soot. She's breathing that. I think oftentimes we are living in a world where we have to live in a world of energy regulation. Dale mentioned FERC, which is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, complex dockets, high-priced lawyers and consultants, a very complex world of energy regulation that the public generally has very little participation in, and affects their pocketbooks because they're paying for it. Well, here, is something where we bring it down home, in that the pollution generated by fossil fuels affects children. It increases asthma. And if you improve the home, if you insulate and electrify it, you improve the health quality of the air inside the house. You help children who are, reduce asthma rates. All kinds of benefits accrue from that. And we ought to be living in a society that's trying to improve the health of children and is trying to improve the health of the elderly. And clean energy will do that, because we're reducing the amount of emissions that damage people's lungs. I think sometimes we need to do a better job in the climate community of framing and messaging our work. Sometimes we talk so much about cost and so much about utility and other kinds of economics. But maybe if I can just say for a moment, I once was asked by a foundation to describe this to them in ways that didn't involve data and didn't involve regulatory language. And I said, okay, someone leaves their home in Hartford, Connecticut. I just pick a place and they have to go to lunch in New Haven. It's an hour and a half away. And they get into their car because there's no alternative. And they drive past all kinds of buildings that are poorly weatherized and have oil burners and producing pollution inside the house and outside the house. They get on the highway and there's a traffic jam, and they're next to a diesel truck that's spewing out pollution. They get to their appointment in New Haven and they're late for lunch. They're rushing around, and it hasn't been a very pleasant morning, right? Imagine the alternative. Imagine to go to your luncheon in another town. You can choose a trolley, a tram, a train. You can drive, but you have an electric vehicle that isn't emitting. When you drive past the buildings, they're weatherized. They're using less energy. The pollution inside is lower. The children who are not increasing their asthma rates because they're living in a poorly built building with oil generation. You go out on the highway, and okay, if you get a traffic jam, the truck next to you is not emitting diesel. Maybe you're still late, but you're not feeling sick to your stomach. And why don't we want to build a world like that? The technology exists. And I'll just leave an image of you of the girl looking out of her window, because it was on the TV news, through the soot-covered window. Why do we want that? we can put that all into the data, and the data should drive policy. But we are really talking about human beings,
Mhm.
in flood zones, coughing, getting sick, missing days at work, missing days at school. That's what's at stake here. And it's not some like big amorphous international problem. It is a big international problem. It's not amorphous, but it's also a very specific problem, that we're dealing with. And that's what's particularly frustrating about what's going on right now. The human impact of this issue is not even being addressed. And I think that's got to change and has to turn around.
Mhm. Thank you. Dale, let me ask you to build on that because I think what
It's going to be hard to top that.
well, no, well, no, I think you will equal that. When you think about the administration's Make America Healthy Again initiative, right? There's a lot of focus on medicine and vaccines. And what I think Dan has just laid out is the connection between human health caused by food that we eat, but also by pollution that we encounter. So when you think about messaging these concerns, and particularly for those in the audience who want to do something, what ideas what approaches have you found useful to connect the dots here and make a compelling case, maybe without all the data, but make a compelling case for action?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that riffs right off of what Dan was describing because I think the most effective things are not, the emission rates going down. Like, what does that even mean? What do the numbers mean? Tons, all these tons. I mean, it's so hard to get your mind around. But when you say plummeting asthma rates, when you say, numbers of children in emergency rooms that can be reduced and show where that is happening because of changes that communities are making that do have those quality of life benefits. I spend a lot of time working in the building sector, and we talk about scaling investment in energy efficiency and electrification in buildings. What does that even mean? And even when you get into, well, it means putting in heat pumps and generating the heat for your home and your hot water from the renewable electricity that we're building instead of from home heating oil, propane, gas that's piped into your house, and understanding all the health impacts of burning gas inside your house in an open flame, which has a lot of health impacts. And talking about what are you really getting? Everybody's getting air conditioning because heat pumps are basically inside out air conditioners. So you get heat, clean electric heat that's not polluting inside your house or outside your house, and you're getting air conditioning, you're getting improved quality of life, you're getting control over the temperature in your living space, which a lot of people who live in urban areas like I do don't always have access to that. And how many times have you been in a building where the window is open in the wintertime because of poor control? So there's so much that we can talk about health and quality of life, as well as jobs. I think other things like price fluctuations, we all know what it's like when prices spike in the winter. And that's when, and you don't want to turn your heat down when you're freezing cold on the coldest day is not the day to ask me to turn my heat down. So how can we think about what we're doing as if you're having clean electric heat that's coming from, the wind farm that you can't even see out in the ocean, you'll never see a price spike again because there is no fuel cost. You are permanently insulated that. Just think about gas prices for gasoline and, for our vehicles. If you are in an electric car, you will never pay for gas again. And the steadiness, not only are you doing, it used to be $1 a gallon equivalent. I'm not sure if we're still at that rate for high, because electric vehicles are so efficient. But just, having that choice. So, I go to the gas station, I have no choice. I have to buy gas. But if I had a choice, because I could, all the choices that Dan was describing, that would actually give me a lot more freedom. So I think those kinds of conversations with people about what really matters in our daily lives, and to our families, and especially to our children and their health, I think are very compelling. But it's difficult to have a little sound bite.
Mhm.
I like air conditioning for all, but it's difficult to have a sound bite that's you know that really connects the dots on these things, especially if you're uh, um, if you adhere to, precision and accuracy, as many of us do, we have to have a little bit longer conversation. But that's what's so wonderful about this kind of a forum, is that you can really get into it. And then people, we're all talking with our friends and our family all the time. And it can be hard to talk about issues that are controversial, but the underlying values that we have are not controversial. And that's a place where we can start and talk to our families and friends about these kinds of things. And there is a lot more support than we see in the political world. That's why these things have been, so many of them had bipartisan support for so long, because they're popular, because people like these benefits.
Right. Um, Dan, I wanted you to pick up on that, but first, there's a question about the data that you're referring to that demonstrates the economic advantage of energy transitions from fossil fuels to alternative sources. And the person asked, where is such data available? Can you point us to a few good sources? And you might, yeah, yeah.
It's a fair question. I don't have a link, but for example, in the world of energy efficiency, okay, this is maybe to try to define what that is. It's providing the same level of service or benefit by using less energy, because you're changing out what people are most familiar with, an old light bulb that uses 100 watts for one that uses 8. So those programs are governed by cost effectiveness tests, meaning they have to be cheaper to invest in and purchase than the more expensive power plant. So if it'll cost more to power that light bulb than it would be to change the light bulb out and make it more efficient. There's plenty of data like that in the energy efficiency world. With respect to coal and natural gas spiked during the when Russia invaded Ukraine. Rates in New England states that I'm most familiar with went up 49%. Those fuel costs were passed on to ratepayers in mechanisms that exist in state law because of the volatility of those prices on the international market. Now they've come down again, but those price spikes were enormous, and it really affected people. Southern Company that I mentioned has switched from coal to natural gas, which is still a fossil fuel. It's somewhat cleaner, because of the price differential. It was just cheaper for them to buy natural gas. And there are wind projects off the coast of the Northeast that were competitive and won competitive bids because the power coming out of them, as Dale said, was cheaper than the alternatives. So
Right.
there's plenty of data out there. I will say though that there are going to be cases where it's not always the clean fuel, will not always be the cheapest fuel right now. There are going to be some situations still where natural gas is going to be a little bit cheaper than electricity for some applications, but we're going to keep collectively, everyone's going to keep working on that. But the data is out there, and we have some reports where the Reggie report and others that we do where we specifically can mention the cost differentials.
Okay.
So it's
Good.
available.
Good. And I just want to answer my own question here because while Dan, you were talking, I put in Google economic advantages of renewable energy. So
Okay.
there are a number
Everyone
of,
Googles when I talk.
I was multitasking, but the International Energy Agency has some great data. The Yale Center for Business and the Environment. And then a very sad fact here I just discovered, that NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, and I'm particularly interested in their activities because I'm in Colorado near Denver, and they used to be a tremendous repository of information. And when you go on their website now looking for the economic advantages of renewable energy, that page is no longer there. And that follows a recent visit by our new Secretary of the Energy, who has de-emphasized the work of NRail. So you can't rely on them for that data anymore that Dan was just talking about. So that is a very sad commentary on what's happening.
Could I
Yeah.
just mention, there's a federal agency, the Energy Information Administration, EIA. It's a part of the U.S. Department of Energy. They have a massive amount of information, and it's still live. But I think the point you're raising with NREL is one we should mention here, is the
Mhm.
stripping of data information from federal websites,
Mhm.
and the replacement of, so tools that people could use to assess cost are gone, just gone. Um, and it's not only occurring in the area of health, it's occurring in the area of energy. The National Climate Assessment, I mean, this is the leading assessment of climate impacts in the country, is under threat. I don't know if it's been disbanded yet or about to be. The social cost of carbon, this is exactly what we're talking about. This is a very sophisticated effort to price cost of carbon pollution, and it helps determine what's the best public policy. That's going to be stripped out, and the people who work on that fired. So information is going to be increasingly inaccessible. It's already started across the board, and this is a society that is dependent on information for markets, for public policy. We believe in education. Information is critical. So to see that happening is really alarming. And what you're talking about is one major, but only one of many examples of this occurring.
Yeah, can I just pipe in on this because when you were talking earlier about the time frame, Dan, and just the science behind that, it always recalls, and I think this is a good time to remind ourselves, the great Neil deGrasse Tyson, science is true whether you believe it or not, and we used to be a society based on science, learning, the rule of law, and what. There's not like we were asking about like what's the litigation strategy. It's not really a litigation strategy. It's a bullying strategy. It's not based in law. And this is the same here. There's not a strategy here that's based in argument and reason. It wants to be based on force. And so you can't have information. Information gets in the way of brute force. So that I think what you're pointing out here is very important. And while I have the floor, if I could just say one other thing, while I
Please.
looked in the questions, while you pointed out that they were sitting there, and I just want to acknowledge that one of the questions said that because we have confidence that we're going to make this transition, it can sound like there's nothing to worry about. And I really do not want to leave that impression with anyone. I mean, there is an enormous amount to worry about. We are in a very, very dangerous position right now. I have confidence in the states, the cities, the communities, and many of the businesses who are a lot quieter than they were during the previous Trump administration, but many of whom are still like diligently plowing forward. And that we will keep doing this. But yes, is there a chance that we're definitely not meeting many targets that many states and companies have, and now we're being hamstrung in a way, like I mentioned with the offshore wind, that it's out of our power. But there's always other places where we can make a lot of progress.
Yep.
And so what I feel confident about is there is still so much that we can do that are going to deliver all of these benefits, while we're, do the other work that's needed, not to live in an administration that wants to impose these kinds of harms and costs and challenges upon us.
And since we certainly don't want to leave people on a downer note here, let's turn our attention to what we can do and where there is some positive activity. And Dan, why don't we start with you and tell us a bit about what municipalities, they don't need to be large, New York City, Dallas type of cities, but smaller communities. What are they doing and what should they be thinking about? If you're the city manager or on the town council, what are some options you have in the midst of all the things that you and Dale have been describing that are not good news?
I'm really glad you asked that question because the local communities, small communities, are doing quite a bit, and they have a lot of they're motivated because they care about their residents. So there are communities that are putting solar generating farms on top of landfills, that are kept. They're looking at ways to improve bike paths and alternatives to cars and traffic calming measures, building codes. In the state of Massachusetts, there's a law called the Green Communities Act, and it encourages communities to adopt building codes that are even more aggressive than the state code. It's a very progressive state when it comes to these issues. So an enormous, I don't know the exact number, but 90 something percent of towns in Massachusetts have adopted a more aggressive energy code. And what does that mean? That means for any new building that's put up or any major renovation, it will be built to much more energy efficient standards. So buildings are a big problem, as Dale, uh, knows better than almost anyone in the country. And once they're built, they're built. They're built for 50 years, 100 years. So it's really important to get that market, and it's towns that are adopting those codes. Um, I would also want to point out from on the positive side of things that you mentioned up to 40 states have clean energy laws. There's over 2 dozen states that have climate laws. As we've already talked about, Texas, of all places, has by far the largest amount of wind installations in the country. It dwarfs the entire amount of energy that New York State consumes. Uh, um, and there's 350 towns involved in the conference of cities organized around climate. I think something like um, 30 million people, I should get the data correct, but live in states where there's a climate pricing program. Like Reggie, which has been so successful. I'll say something about Reggie again. Reggie has contributed to reductions in climate pollution 50% faster than the rest of the country in an area where the electric rates have gone up at a lower pace than elsewhere. So
Mhm.
non so states that are not addressing climate are experiencing higher rate increases and higher forms of pollution. And that's a fact. That's a data point. So the problem though that I know we want to be positive here, but there is a financing problem. The clean energy transition does you have to finance the change, and that's where communities need some help and face some the need for creativity, ingenuity on financing. But it's happening, and I will say again, another positive example in the state of Maine under the climate plan that's going on. They are issuing grants to communities to do climate resiliency and do the very things we're talking about. So it's kind of a movement quietly under the radar screen that these are the changes communities make to make the quality of life better in their towns and make their communities more livable. So it is happening.
Mhm. Mhm. And Dale, do you have some other examples?
Um, yeah, I mean, one thing that I wanted to mention was just the breadth of interest in these kinds of things across the country in all states. And we had 44 states, so that's almost all of them, participate in what was called the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program. It was a program under the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, to compete for $5 billion worth of funding. And it really could be almost anything that was reducing
Mhm.
climate pollution. And they put in $30 billion worth of proposals for a $5 billion program. And almost every state participating. Some of them didn't call their plan a climate plan, but who cares? Like there's interest in doing these things. I mean, every governor has constituents who would like to drive, and some of them will be driving electric vehicles. So you have to figure out how to build out the charging infrastructure in a smart way, in the lowest cost way. And we shouldn't sugarcoat that there are costs. Like you're buying new things, the EV charging infrastructure. But there are also enormous savings. The history of energy costs is not that they just go down and down and down. We're always spending money on energy infrastructure, and we can just choose to spend it on smarter things that have a longer term, all of these benefits. And it's making those different investment decisions that actually allow you to make the transition without the net cost. You just have to have that planning and not be dealing with it in an emergency situation.
Mhm. Good. Let me pose a question here that Art has asked, which is how do the opponents of the changes you're describing manage their public policy positions to defend themselves? What tactics do they use? Do they use political lobbyists? So, Dale, you want to
Yes, yes, and yes.
answer? Yes.
Well, number one is job killing energy tax. Everything can be labeled with a job killing energy tax, even when the thing that you're proposing is itself a job killing energy tax. Like some of the things we're talking about, we want to kill all of the jobs in offshore wind. I mean, we're building ports, we're building so many things here. There are so many jobs at stake. So, in my experience, job killing energy tax is attack one. The other is, and these are all done through multi-million-dollar media campaigns, which are very difficult to defend against because, sort of the world of nonprofit advocacy groups don't have very much money. Often the companies who are leading the way on the clean energy are new companies that don't have the same lobbyists, that don't have the same budget for communications, that don't have the same industry associations that have been operating for decades doing these kinds of things. And by scaring people, oh, you want a heat pump? That's going to cost you $30,000, or I'm coming to take your gas stove away. People who cook love their gas stoves, but only because they have not experienced induction cooking, which is far superior. But we don't know it yet. We're not familiar with it yet. Nobody had to come and steal my rotary phone. My rotary phone was thrown away of my own volition. And that's what's going to happen, with these new clean energy technologies as well. I mean, for some among in this audience might remember when we were told that electric cars were going to be like golf carts and we were all going to be forced to drive in these inferior, not something that goes 0 to 60 in 2 seconds, So, the misinformation campaigns, the lobbyists, are all part of a well-worn script. And, we just have to be, well, it is easier to win when you're right. And like I said, you have we are devoted to truth and accuracy, which is not always true within much of the opposition. But it is very challenging. And that's why we have jobs to do.
Right. Dan, any thoughts on this?
I totally agree. Well put. I mean, the argument that everything is a tax, that it will, and then overstating cost is another common one. So there's, studies are put out claiming the cost of meeting climate targets or clean energy is astronomical. We just dealt with this recently. 6 so-called think tanks got together and put out a report. And we have a group of people on staff who do data work, and they looked at it and they found serious flaws in the calculations. So they were way overstating the cost of what avoiding a ton of climate pollution would be. Without that, their data was flawed, but they were trying to create an argument. This is actually something that's occurring where it's not just the executive orders coming from the federal government. It's now empowering people at the state level to offer some of the same arguments against moving forward with clean energy. That Dale's already mentioned, it's too expensive, it's a tax. And then the disinformation comes in, where when you start to look under the hood, there are real flaws and assumptions, but you need to be able to look under the hood and find the data to do that. Otherwise, the report goes out to legislators and media, and they're left with the conclusion, oh my gosh, this is too expensive, we can't afford to do it, and all of that. And it's just it's flawed information that's disserving the public.
Yeah. But can I just give you a little example of that? Because I'm thinking, as I just mentioned, the $30,000 cost for it. It's like if you just bought your, fossil fuel boiler and you had to throw it in the garbage and just buy a completely new electric system, that's an additional cost of, we'll just say $30,000. If your boiler just died and you have to buy a new one anyway, and you're saying, well, will I buy a new fossil fuel heating system or will I buy a clean electric heating system? There might be no cost at all. So it just depends. I mean, that's just an example how you can say something that could actually cost nothing costs $30,000 because you're not explaining the context. So that's the kind of thing that happens all the time, and it's very difficult to see it if you don't think about these things all the time. And that's just the mantra that you're being hit with.
Yeah, I agree with all that. Let me offer my perspective, having spent numbers of years on Capitol Hill advocating for various clean energy policy proposals. And when going into certain congressional offices, you hear some of the arguments, Dale and Dan, that you just made about costs, but you also hear and get a sense of who's donating money to the campaign. So our campaign finance laws are very problematic. And where the money is coming from to maintain a seat in Congress or run for the presidency, is significant. And the fossil fuel industry contributes hundreds of millions of dollars into the political process for their commercial, self-interest. There's no doubt about it. But you also, I have found here a willingness, particularly on the part of some moderate Republicans, to address these issues. But as Dale has said a few times, they don't want to call it climate change. They may refer to it as extreme weather, severe weather, some term that is not acknowledging maybe what progressives or the left is talking about. But it's the same set of concerns, that there are economic consequences to not doing anything. But some of this is also just cognitive dissonance. Is like, there are people on Capitol Hill who don't, unfortunately, want to recognize the transition we're undergoing, because this is all very inconvenient, right? To make these adjustments will mean that we have to make some adjustments in the way we live. And, there's a segment of the population just not interested in that. The last thing I'll just say about this question, from my perspective about political lobbyists, is, these are very well-funded industries who have done a great job over decades about talking about the positive impacts that fossil fuels have in given communities. But I think that conversation is changing quite a bit as alliances get built with labor unions, with social justice groups, with construction companies, who are finding that there's a lot of benefit in renewables. But maybe that argument's not carrying the day yet. So we have to go back to the questions here. After that, we have a question from Daisy, who, acknowledges that we live in a very polarized time where there's also a lot of mis and disinformation. And so how do we mitigate the political divide when it comes to environmental conservation? As one of you said, clean energy has been supported by both parties, but it seems that the Republican Party is not leaning in as much as possible. I would note, before Dan, you answer that question, that there is discussion right now in the House of Representatives in DC about the clean energy tax credits, which had been adopted under the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a major big deal. And there are at least 21 House Republicans who've expressed their support to Mike Johnson, the House leader, to maintain those tax credits because their districts are benefiting.
Mm-hmm.
So, Dale, what is some advice on both how to talk about it so you don't make the other side wrong, and you can
Mm-hmm.
kind of bridge these divides both in perception, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's a really hard question. It's like the question of our time, right? But I'll give a couple of thoughts. That I was actually in New Orleans recently and looking at some community projects to make resilience hubs, and they were at churches, and they had solar and storage. So that, I mean, this is like ground zero for climate resilience in New Orleans, right? And this is Mike Johnson's districts. And it's all being done by churches. So there's a communication that's happening in the faith community with their congressional delegation about what they're doing for their communities so that when disaster strikes, everyone can go to the church and you will have water, you will have electricity, you will have either heating or cooling, depending on what time of year the tragedy is happening. And they are hugely dependent on what's called direct pay, which is one of the provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act that allows nonprofit entities and local government. You can completely see how this makes sense for local government, municipal facilities that need to be resilient to storms and keep functioning, that they can take advantage of tax credits so that they can get those lower costs for solar plus for storage, for heat pumps. So just talking about what's actually happening in local communities and thinking about people who are already trusted, part of the constituency of maybe the constituency that you're not part of. I mean, it is easier at the local level, and it's more difficult at the state level, but still easier than at the federal level, where it's not really about anything substantive. It's been politicized in order to be weaponized in order so that I can win and you can lose. It has nothing to do with the underlying policy. I mean, you mentioned some things earlier in your conversation, Richard, which I thought were sort of like, I felt nostalgic for a minute of a throwback when people actually disagreed for a reason, as opposed to purely for politics. So figuring out how to get around that, if when you come up with great ideas for this in your experience, Daisy, please circle back to us. But I do think it's helpful to have, I would say, two things. What's real things that are happening on the ground, in places that resonate with whoever you're talking to, and people who are and you can find this everywhere in rural communities, in the reddest of red states. There is something happening in every sector of the economy that's part of the clean energy transition that's supported by the constituent of whoever it is that we're talking about. And that's, I think, a lot of those constituencies there's like a backdoor whispering campaign, please don't cut that. Whereas in other states, you have the AGs mounting the litigation. So there's a wave of communication. It's happening on two tracks. One is not visible to us.
Yeah, all good points. And Dan, what is your advice? And you're on mute, Dan.
Sorry. I don't know if I have advice on this because it's a great thing to have another program about the advice part. But I do, there's the Yale Center on Climate Communications. I don't know if you're familiar with that. And they do polling, and I just want to point out how striking their polling is. I would really invite people to go check out the site. 2024 polling, 72% of Americans believe climate change is happening, global warming is happening. 63% believe we have to take action on it. I say that because I'm not convinced this is really going to the comments you've made about political lobbying and the comments Dale's made, that the polarization around this issue is as stark as it seems. I think there is a disconnect going on between what the public wants and what our political system is delivering. And the reasons for that are largely ones, Richard, you've identified in your comments. It is very hard to, people who care about climate as a voting issue are not donating to campaigns the way some major corporations are. Whatever the reasons are, the body politic supports this. They want it to happen. And when it's taken out of the polarized political context, and you've talked about the examples Dale's mentioning, the electric vehicle car plant that's going in Georgia, or the battery plant that's going in South Carolina, or even more smaller, 10,000 jobs being created in the Atlanta area just from these clean energy manufacturing facilities. And you ask people, once they're familiar with changes being made, the solar on the landfill, and their town is getting cheaper power now, and their energy bills are down, and they're experiencing that in real time. That's what's going on. And this, very effective distraction at the national level is consuming a lot of our attention as it needs to, because it's a real threat. But what is the reality on the ground? What do people really believe? What do they want to see happen in their communities and in their country? I don't think it's as polarized as the political debate would suggest. And I don't have advice on how to surmount that, other than we have to just keep doing our thing, talking to our neighbors, going to the local planning board, calling our legislators up, and taking whatever action we can in our homes, and putting heat pumps in, putting heat pump water heaters in. They're very cost effective, by the way. And
work
keep
in
on
cold weather,
Yeah, they're great. And your bills go down a lot.
says
And
the
I
man from Maine.
do not have stock in a heat pump water company. But, I think we should step back sometimes and keep perspective on what is really going on and where the information is coming from.
Right. Well, good. I'm glad we found a way to end on a positive note
Okay.
and offer some guidance to folks about actions they can take. And I think the adage of, think globally, act locally is very relevant here. And, we are in the midst of a major transition, but I think as Dale and Dan have both suggested, a lot of the action and necessary steps have to come from the community level. So, Jeannie, back to you.
Great. Dale, Dan, and Richard, thank you for sharing your perspectives on a complex issue that clearly touches all of us in so many ways every day. Dan, you started this, so we do hope you will come back and let's revisit this in the future with another Network for Responsible Public Policy program. We'd like to continue the discussion as the impact of the administration's actions continue to evolve. Ashley, thank you for your work with us this semester. Congratulations on your upcoming graduation. In the next few days, this program will be available as a video on our website, nfrpp.org, to share with your friends, on social media, or in your classroom. Please sign up for our newsletter to learn more about our upcoming programs. Our next program is scheduled for Thursday, June 26th at 7:30 p.m. We'll explore the future of global politics with another distinguished panel of speakers. We'll see you on June 26th. Thank you all, and good night.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Night.